3, database programming in practice. So this is the part, well, I'm just going to live code some database code in IntelliJ. So I'm just going to go to that as quickly as possible, but I will say something before I get there, because I will just tell you what I'm going to code, what kind of code I'm going to make, so you can follow along more easily. So I'm going to write CROT methods. So CROT methods are create, read, update, and delete. It's not particularly hard concept. It's just these methods. It can be a bit confusing that create responds to an insert statement and reads responds to a select statement. But apart from that, it's quite obvious, I think, what these do. So you'll see it in practice. I just want to show you create, read, update, and delete statements for the two tables I have. So here we have the create, read, update, and delete. Do note there are more than one read. And that is quite typical, because sometimes you want just one object. Sometimes you want a list of objects by some sort of search criteria. There can be many different search criteria, all depending on your use cases. So we can have quite a few read, but create, update, and delete are usually just the one. So note the create. So I'm giving it a string name. If you remember the code I used for insert, I just needed the name. So I'm creating an author string name. It returns an author. So in that create, I'm making a new author object and I'm returning it. And once you have that, that should be the way you create author objects. Because it also writes it to the database. So now all your authors, if you do it that way, all your authors come from the database or are in the database somehow. And that's nice to know. It's nice to know that you don't have an author object that you then go, oh, I need to remember to save that, and where do I do that in the code? Now everything is always saved. Everything is already persisted in the database. And that's about it for this. I made two. Well, there's one thing. Note the name. So it's called a data access object, and data access object is just an object that has CROT methods. It's called DAO or DAO for short. So this is usually called an author DAO. This one is called a book DAO. And apart from the create needing more parameters because the table is more involved, there is nothing especially weird about the book DAO. So with this in mind, I'll just go straight into IntelliJ and we can start coding. Right, let's implement some of this. So you can see here, I've made some code already. I made this as a singleton. It's a rather obvious singleton because you only ever need one. But you can also see in the constructor that I did something here. I made this line that is supposed to register the driver, and as you can tell here, it doesn't work. This is red because it doesn't know where the driver is. So I have already downloaded the driver, so I'm going to show you how to set it up in the project. So under File, we choose the project structure. When we get the project structure, we choose Libraries. And then we add a library under plus. It's a Java library, so we take the first one. And then what I need to do is I need to navigate to where I downloaded it to. So in my case, I have a folder called Java where I store all this stuff. And then I find the one that I need to download to use here. It's PostgreSQL 42.2.11. So this is the newest version at the time of recording. So I'm just going OK. And well, it asks me to confirm. I'm not even sure why, but here it is. So I say OK, and now it's no longer red. So that's what it takes to get this into the project. let's start doing some code. I'm going to do this in order so that I'm taking both the create methods, then all the read methods, then both update methods, then both delete methods. So let's start with a create method. So if you remember what you're supposed to do, you're supposed to start by getting a connection. So let's get a connection. And remember that we have to use the try, because remember that we always want to close the connection and we want to make absolutely sure. So try connection equals, and yes, import that. It is Java SQL connection, driver manager, get connection, and now the JDBC URL. So the JDBC URL always starts with JDBC. We're using PostgreSQL, so that comes next. I'm running my database on my own computer, so I'm using localhost. And the port number is the default 5432. And my database is called Postgres. Now, because I am using a schema, which you should always do, and because I don't want to write for any table, want to write the JDBC dot, I like to actually add current schema here is JDBC, because now that is the default and I don't have to say JDBC dot for anything in there. Okay. Then I have a username, and I'm using the standard user Postgres for convenience, and I chose the rather terrible password admin for this one. So this is how I get my connection. It's a bit long, and you might want to do something with it. Let me just show you. So what we have here is, now I have the connection, and I need in here to start writing the code. Before I do that, when code like this gets rather long, rather complex, and you want to do it over and over and over again, because we need this in all the methods, what you can do is you can select it all, and once you've selected it all, you can press Ctrl-Alt-M. You will also find this in the refactor menu. And it's going to make a method for us. And this method is going to be called getConnection, which is a good name for it, but you can change it, obviously. So, refactor. So now it's down here. I like to have these in the beginning of the code, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a personal preference. I'll put it up here. Now I can just call getConnection every time I want a connection, and it will call this method. So that's just a bit of convenience, but it makes the code much easier to read. Okay, so that's the connection. So what do we get from the connection? Well, we can prepare a statement. That's what we need to do, right? So what is it with this statement? Well, it's an insert statement. So we insert into book. What does book have? It has ISBN, it has a title, it has year of publishing, and it has an author ID. And then the values. And because we are preparing a statement, then executing a statement, the values are going to be question mark, and question mark. This is our prepared statement, except we should actually assign that to something. So again, let me show you an IntelliJ chip. Ctrl-Alt and then V for variable. Now we have a prepared statement. Let me just make it a bit shorter, just call it statement. I think that's perfectly fine. This line again is a bit long because of the SQL, but there's no really good way to fix it. I guess I can do this. So those are the question marks. So now we need the set int and set whatnot. So first of all, just take them in order. First question mark is the ISBN. That's a string, so 1 ISBN. The next is the title, that's another string. Now comes an int. Sorry. Finally, another int. The author ID. So what's the author ID? Well, we get it from the author, right? Author.getID. So this is preparing the statements. So it is a few lines of code. Most of it is the SQL. There's no good alternative to doing all this. There is a bad alternative. Don't use the bad alternative. Do what I just showed you. We'll see in video 4 why this is the right way to do it. Okay, so with these in place, we can execute it. So statement.execute. And remember, when we have insert, update, or delete, we are using execute update because we don't expect a result set back. So that's it. Except we need to return something that's not null. So it returns a book. Well, it should return a book that's like the one we just created. So new book, ISBN, title, year of publishing, and author. And now we don't return this. So if you now with this, if you use this instead of calling new book in your code, instead you are taking the book.impl and you're calling create, then you're going to always have books. Every time you create a book, it will also be created in the database. And that's the strength of this, is that you know what's going on in the database at all time, but you're still working with classes and methods, and the SQL is only in here. Let's take a look at doing the same for author. So right away, it seems that maybe create for an author is pretty much the same to do it for a book, but there is a small wrinkle on it that we should look at. So let's get to it. You can see that I already made the get connection method, so we don't have to write that again. So try connection. So that's the same. I need to remember to actually throw. So prepared statement. Oh, we already seen this code a couple of times because I used that as an example, so I guess we can just move on quite quickly. Values, question mark, and now statement dot set string, 1, name. This is all very fine. So this is not where the problem is. Now, where the problem is what do I return? Well, I return, as before, right? I return a new author. What does that require? Well, if you really squint, you can see what it tells me. It requires an ID and a name. And what is the ID? I should probably tell it which table it is, huh? Then it will stop yelling at me. Yeah, that's nice. Okay. Where do we get the ID? The problem is with the ID, we don't have it. It's auto-generated. So it could be any number. And the right way to do this, some people would try sometimes to see if they can select it out of the database. It's very hard to do in a consistent manner that always works. So, now let's do it the right way, just like everything else we do. So, what we're going to do is we're going to say that when we get this statement should not just run, it should also, when it runs, it should return to us which keys were generated. So, I'll add that here. Prepared statement dot return generated keys. So this is an extra optional parameter you can put on to say something about not just preparing the statement with an SQL, but also a bit about how it should run. That doesn't give us the keys though. We need to get the keys. So execute update hasn't changed. That still returns it still returns at just a number. That's how many did we insert, and that's 1. So that always returns the number 1. That's not interesting. We are not going to change this into execute query because it's not a query. It's not a select statement, so we are still doing execute update. What we can do now, though, is we can say statement dot get generated keys. And what this is, let me just use Control-Alt-V again, because you can see what's going on. Now we have the generated keys, let's just call them keys. It's a result set. So how do we deal with a result set? Well, we use a while, right? Except it's kind of silly to use a while when we know there's only 1. So we need a while that goes through only once. That's called an if. So if keys.next return new author. So it needs an ID. Well, it gets it from keys. And get int. Now, usually I would put in here the name of the attribute, but I don't actually know what the name of the attribute is, but there's only 1. We can use a number to refer to the attributes as well as a name. I don't prefer to do that normally because if I know what the name is, it's much cleaner to do that. But, well, I only have an index, so let's call that index 1. And if you're very used to arrays and array lists, it might be strange to you that the first one is 1 and not 0. But that's how it is in JDBC, and we just have to deal with it. Okay, and then a name, but we have the name, so we just put in the name. Now it complains because what happens here? And honestly, beats me. If it comes back with no generated keys after all this, then something is terribly wrong in the database. If something is wrong, we should probably throw something. And the thing this throws is an SQL exception, so let's do that. I have nothing reasonable to return here. So that's create. That's create with generated keys. So it's a bit more involved. Because we have this extra thing about we also need to get the keys. Let's go to the reads. We have them down here. Read by ID. We're doing the same, right? So, same setup. And now, prepared statement. So how do we get something from the database? Obviously with select. Something with ID, it seems. So let's do it this way. So note I use select all. I use the star. You will find that when we work with SQL this way, we want objects. And because we want objects, we want to have all the data from a row because we need to fill out the object. So you will see this a lot where you're using select star rather than just select some of the things. Okay, so I'm selecting everything from author where ID is something, so I need to specify that something. That was wrong. Int, obviously, and 1, ID. Here we are. So that's the statement. So, prepared. Now we need to execute. And remember that when we have a select, we're using an so statement dot execute query because it's a select. And as usual, I'm doing here. I want a result set. And with the result set, what do we do? Well, we're using while, except ID is a primary key, so we only get 1. How do we deal with that? Well, we just did, didn't we? So if there are more, so if they're right, and in else, it's just, well, this is not in a database. So you're trying to find something that's not in a database, and you could throw an exception for it, I suppose. But it also seems pretty obvious. You're looking for something that doesn't exist. That sounds like a null to me. So let's return a null. But here, we need to return something. And what to return? Well, we need a name, right? So how do we get that? Well, the usual way. Result set dot get string name. So now we can return a new author. We have the ID and we have the name, so that's easy. Okay, so that's a read by ID. And this one is now dead. Okay, so almost all DAOs will have a read method like this, where you are reading by the primary key. It's sort of a key feature in code that you can get. When you know the primary key, you can also get the right object that corresponds to it. So you might as well write this because you're going to use it at some point. But for the other reads, it depends a lot on what your use cases are. So I have invented a use case where you can search for an author by name, or rather by part of a name. That's why I call it a search string. So let's try to do that. We are doing pretty much the same. And I'm not planning on returning null, so let's just get this out of the way. So I'm preparing a statement. Select all from author. Where what exactly? Well, something with name, huh? And because I want to look for part of a string, so part of a name, so I can find all authors that are called Franz. I want to use the like operator. Still uses a question mark. So the like operator allows us to look for more advanced things than just things that are exactly equal. So, for instance, I can set this string as % plus search string. And that means I will get all authors that has the search string anywhere in their name. You can look up like to see how that works if you don't know that already. Okay, with this in mind, we are done with it. We are ready for the result set. And, well, here we do have many. Note that I'm returning a list of authors. That's kind of a hint. We need to build up a list. So let's just use array list for it. So an array list author. Import that. Result is a new array list. And now, since we have many, I'm done with these unusual ones. Well, almost. With the unusual ones that are just an if, and do the more common ones that is a while, because we don't know how many we get in our result set. So while result set next, we are going to we need all right. We are creating an author, so we need two things. We need an ID and we need a name, and both should be in our result set. So let's just do that. Not result, sorry. Okay, and with that in mind, we can now create an author. And add it to our result. And at the end, we return result. So, here we go. This is the typical read. Right. There's typically two kinds. There is one where you only read by the primary key and return 1. That's the one we have up here. Then you have maybe none, but typically one or more of these where you have a special need to read many of these. And when you have a special need to read many of these, you write it like this. Right. The only thing that's really different is the select statement and how I prepare it. Everything from here and out is the same. And it can be tempting, and I usually fall for that temptation to say, okay, well, we already saw that we can make methods out of something when it becomes too similar. And you might fall for that temptation. I'm not going to do it here, but you might make a method that takes a result set and returns an array list of authors if you have many of these. Okay, so that's the read methods, except that's read methods from authors. So let's just do them over here as quickly as I can. So a lot of it is the same. So since a lot of it is the same, I'm just going to do it. But there are a couple of things. So I'm going to prepare a statement. And what statement? So before I had select all from, similarly, select all from book where ISBN equals question mark, right? So that's what I did before, except it was author. But this is not good enough for this. And the reason it's not good enough is a book, when I create a book, I need an author object. And there are two ways of doing that. One is to reach out to this and say, okay, read by this author by D and use that. Which is okay, I guess. I sometimes do that, but it's two calls to the database. Why would we want to call the database twice when we can just use a join? So this is what I'm going to do. So let's just join them. So we have everything in one. Okay. So that's my SQL. So let's continue. From now on, it's the same. almost the same. I need to create the author, so it's a bit more, but you'll see. It's almost the same. There's only one book, right? It's ISBN, so it's an if. So let's get everything we can out from this, and then see what to do with it. We already have the ISBN, so no mind. But all the others. Let me just make this a bit more Java-like here. And finally, author name. So now we have enough to create an author. So let's do that first. And that's here. And now that we have an author, we also have enough to create a book. And now we can return it. So that's a bit more code. And it's a bit more code simply because there's more attributes. And you'll find this, that you get this explosion of code when you have an explosion of attributes. Let me just go and do it again with read by title. It's going to be exactly the same, and you're even going to see some copy paste. We have this search string thing. We already did that over here with the like. Over here with the like. That's also going to be the same thing. So I'm doing it mostly for completeness. And then I will need to fix that, of course. But apart from that, so let's start with this. That's definitely not good enough. So what are we doing? We're doing this. So all we need is actually the array list. So let's make that. Oh, I forgot to call it something. So this is the read by title, and yeah, it's longer. It combines elements from the one we had above and the one we have below. So I'm also getting a few warnings that I am writing the same code over and over again. I'm not going to fix that here. There is also another wrinkle on this. Is that I'm creating a new author for every book. That might be okay. But if there's a lot of books here that have the same author, it's kind of a waste, and you can do something to fix that by caching it. I'm not going to do that here. It's really not what this is about. But this is how you work when you have something that has a reference, right? You join them, and then you make this. So update. There really isn't much in update that we haven't already seen. So let me just try doing it and then get to it when we get to it. I am doing the wrong thing. Here we are. Okay, so I need the SQL. So what are we doing? We're updating, so we need an update statement. So what are we updating? Well, we're updating a book. And when we're updating a book, well, what we need is this book already has a primary key. So what are we updating? We must be updating the book with the same primary key. So that's what's in our where. And then what's in our actual set part of the update is, well, we're just setting all the other attributes. So this is going to be a bit involved again because we have 4 question marks, but apart from that, there's nothing new, right? It's just, oh, it's a title, so get that from a book. And that's it. There's nothing to return. You can see this is a void method. Why would it return? Suppose it could return how many it changed, but update a book, then it changed 1, right? So there's no reason to have a method that just always returns 1. So this is the update. It does nothing else. It's very tempting, so I guess I fall for that temptation to just copy paste it into here and say, so what's the update here? Well, it's different because it's much simpler, right? We can only... So we're updating the author. And we are setting the name. And it has nothing else. Except for the primary key, which is ID. Done. So what do we get here? Well, the first one was author name. And, well, it's not... I should have done... Okay. So let's delete something. That's even easier. It's so much easier that I'm going to do the copy-paste route again. Because how do we delete? Well, we don't do it by an update statement, of course. We do it with a delete from author. There's no set in delete. Delete from author where. Okay. So we don't need this. We can just use this and we're done. So delete is clearly the simplest one. It just calls a delete statement. There's nothing new in here that we haven't seen already. Let me just do it over here. Difference being, it's a book. The primary key is an ISBN. So that's not an int, that's a string. And book.getISBN. And that's the delete. So nothing more to say about the delete. So this is the full code. I'm going to put a link in the notes about where to find the fully implemented code that I'm showing you here. See you in part 4.